East Berlin, April of 1956. The storm falls with fury over the fields of Adlershof in the southeast of the city. Water beats the mud, and the noise of thunder blends with the distant hum of electrical transformers. In the darkness, two Soviet trucks stop beside a trench opened by maintenance crews. The yellow lights of the headlights illuminate wet faces, soaked uniforms, and the metallic gleam of tools driven into the ground. A group of engineers from the Ministry of Communications works in haste. An electrical surge, which occurred hours earlier, has interrupted several telephone lines from the Soviet barracks at Karlshorst, a strategic area where officers of the KGB and the Red Army operate. The order is clear: restore the connection before dawn. The men dig with picks and shovels, opening the rain-hardened mud. The damp earth smells of iron and ozone. One of them, a young technician named Yuri, shouts over the noise of the storm, "There's something here. This isn't ministry wiring." His supervisor approaches. Among the gray cables of the telephone system, a different metallic structure appears, painted matte black, with markings none of them recognize. The foreman orders careful digging. Little by little, they uncover a sealed chamber, rectangular in shape, attached to a conduit that disappears westward beneath the invisible border that divides the city. The find halts the work. The men look at one another without speaking. It is not Soviet equipment, nor is it civilian. The foreman gives the order in a low, almost fearful voice. "Call command, immediately." Hours later, the area is cordoned off by soldiers. The engineers are evacuated and replaced by counterintelligence officers from the Ministry for State Security, the feared Stasi. Under the supervision of a KGB major, they begin to remove the earth with surgical precision. What appears before them is something no one expected to find: a tunnel reinforced with steel the size of a subway train, equipped with electric lighting, ventilation, and carefully concealed cable lines. One of the agents goes down a metal ladder. His flashlight travels through the darkness and stops on a wall lined with microphones, coils, and tape recorders. Every meter of the tunnel is a laboratory of espionage. Boxes marked with inscriptions in English: Western Electric, British Cable Works. The officer switches on one of the recorders. The reel turns for a few seconds, squeals, and a voice in Russian emerges from the speakers. It is a telephone conversation, intercepted. Silence. Then another voice. Different, speaking from a military exchange. The agent looks up at his superior. No one says a word. Outside, the storm continues. Water enters through the cracks in the tunnel and falls in slow, regular drops onto the concrete floor. The Soviets advance through the passage, measuring its length: 50 meters, 100, 200, 500. The tunnel does not stop until it reaches the boundary with the western sector of Berlin, British territory. The discovery is reported to the Kremlin within hours. Moscow responds with a single instruction: keep the find secret until further notice. The KGB understands at once what it has on its hands. This is not a simple intrusion. It is a strategic humiliation. A Soviet colonel, soaked by the rain, watches the tunnel entrance as the men seal the access. "How long have they been down there?" he asks. The chief engineer cannot answer. Perhaps months, perhaps years. The officers look at one another in silence, aware that the enemy has been listening to everything. Military calls, reports, personal conversations. Every word transmitted over Soviet cables has been recorded, archived, and analyzed somewhere in the British sector. On a rainy night over Berlin, the West's deepest secret has just been unearthed. It had begun as one of the most ambitious operations of Western espionage and ended up as a trap built upon its own secret. At the end of the Second World War, Berlin was turned into a desert of brick and smoke. The avenues that once saw armies parade were now rubble, and upon them rose the new battlefield, a city split into 4 zones administered by the victors. What was meant to be a temporary occupation became a board of power where every street, every building, and every voice counted. In 1949, the division ceased to be provisional. 2 flags, 2 currencies, 2 political systems coexisting in the same city. West Berlin, controlled by the British, Americans, and French. East Berlin, under the Soviet fist. The border between them was invisible at first, barely a line on military maps, but it soon filled with barbed wire, watchtowers, and armed patrols. The air of Berlin became a mix of dust, coal, and suspicion. By day, trains and trams still crossed the city, carrying workers, spies, and smugglers in the same car. By night, the silence was full of footsteps that did not want to be heard. The Soviet police checked documents on the bridges. British soldiers did the same in the tunnels. In the markets of the East, American watches were sold in exchange for bread. In cafes of the West, agents of the communist bloc bought secrets for cigarettes. In the West, the newspapers spoke of freedom and reconstruction. In the East, the murals proclaimed socialist fraternity. But beneath both discourses, another war was being fought, invisible, between intelligence services. Berlin became the world capital of espionage. No other city in history had so many embassies, bases, and intelligence offices per square meter. The rooftops were full of antennas, the basements of microphones. In the bars of the French sector, one could hear conversations in English, Russian, and German at once. On every corner, a taxi driver could be an informant, a photographer could be a double agent, a messenger could carry an envelope or a confession. Espionage had become routine and paranoia a way of life. In this city, a MI6 officer would say years later, even the wind seems to come from two directions. Berlin was not just a setting, it was another character, a living being that breathed information, where every secret had a price and every lie could save a life. The sewers turned into corridors of intelligence, the subway tunnels into routes of escape and surveillance. The old air raid shelters of the war served as laboratories for the new conflicts of the century. The Allies maintained a precarious official collaboration, but in practice, they competed among themselves. Americans, British, and French distrusted the Soviets, and the Soviets distrusted everyone else. Among them, alliances were fragile, temporary, as changeable as the weather over the Spree. In the offices of the Kremlin, Berlin was seen as an open wound in the heart of Europe. For Washington, it was a shop window, proof that capitalism could survive in the midst of communism. For the British, it was a board where they could play their last great act of imperial espionage. During the early years of the Cold War, borders did not move with tanks, but with information. Every intercepted telegram, every conversation overheard, every plan copied could change the balance of the world. By the middle of 1953, the city was already a creature divided into two halves that watched, spied on, and hated each other with the same intensity with which they depended on one another. Between them stretched a void, a belt of land, ruined streets, empty lots, where shadows walked faster than light. It was the perfect place for a tunnel, and the city, as if sensing what was to come, seemed to hold its breath. Spring of 1953. In London and in Langley, the intelligence offices breathed a mix of ambition and urgency. The Cold War had turned information gathering into the most valuable currency. Every memorandum, every intercepted call could change decisions that affected millions. In MI6, officers discussed in detail and with a certain skepticism a simple and dangerous question: how to listen to the Soviet High Command in the heart of East Berlin without crossing the border? The answer some proposed sounded like technical madness and diplomatic peril. Dig down to their telephone lines and tap them directly. In Langley, the newly strengthened CIA, still building itself as a global organization, looked on with interest. That agency sought its first major operational victory in Europe, something that would prove its capacity to gather strategic intelligence without relying on partners who might leak or keep silent. When the British laid out the idea of an underground access, the Americans saw the opportunity. A tunnel, camouflaged under the western sector, that would reach the lines feeding the Karlshorst barracks. From there, microphones and recorders could collect hours and hours of military conversations, orders, and plans. The result promised to be overwhelming. The proposal rested on a successful precedent. In the early 1950s, in Vienna, the British service had managed to tap a Soviet line with results relevant to Western intelligence. That proved it was technically possible to intercept perfectly guarded communications. But extrapolating that operation to Berlin meant scaling the risks by an order of magnitude. A tunnel hundreds of meters long under a divided city was not only an engineering challenge, it was a political bet that, if it failed, would imply an international scandal and a humiliation capable of shattering any Western cooperation in Germany. Meetings between analysts, engineers, and influential officers became frequent. Plans were spread out on tables, sections of maps were projected with the layout of pipes and telephone lines. Some team members were skeptical by professional instinct, others ambitious to the point of recklessness. In a briefing room in Whitehall, the MI6 section chief traced the line of action with his finger and said, "Kurt, if we do this, we do it right. In absolute secrecy. No piece can betray the rest." Beside him, a veteran CIA officer replied with contained irony, "We've stuck needles into many wells, sir. This would be a needle piercing the skin of Europe." The central tension was clear, technically possible, politically suicidal. Burying the project under a warehouse in the British zone would require false municipal permits, equipment capable of digging without noise, hidden generators, and a ventilation system that would not arouse suspicion. It also required men with deft hands and nerves of steel, willing to work for weeks within a few meters of the border. No one in the room wanted to imagine the consequences of being discovered. Massive diplomatic expulsions, public demands, accusations of large-scale espionage, and worst of all, the possibility that the USSR, upon discovering the spying, would react unpredictably. In a corridor of St. James's Station, the British operations lead whispered to his American counterpart, "If we pull this off, we'll have a window onto all their movements in East Germany. But if it leaks, we'll have dug our own political grave." The American, a glass of whiskey in his hand, nodded slowly. "Then we can't let it leak. Period." Meanwhile, in the technical offices, engineers designed solutions to the practical problems. How to support a tunnel 2.7 meters high without the machine's noise being heard at the surface. How to remove the spoil without attracting attention from the nearby market. How to run lengths of cable to the interception points while avoiding trenches and controlled crossings. Every answer added another layer of complexity and raised the moral price of the operation. After several weeks of deliberation, the team agreed to take the step. It was not a decision taken by a single head, but by a pragmatic coalition. The British would contribute local knowledge and operational camouflage, the Americans, capital, recording equipment, and part of the logistics. In a low voice, before they separated, the head of MI6 pronounced a sentence that would be etched in the files. "We will do what is not done. Dig where no one looks and listen where everyone speaks. If we get caught, let no one say we didn't warn them." And so, the impossible idea ceased to be a document on a table and became a concrete plan. Operation Gold. The city of Berlin, which already breathed secrets, was about to receive under its streets a new vein of intelligence. It was the promise of a treasure, and precisely for that reason, the greatest risk of a war of shadows that was only just beginning. In the summer of 1953, the project took shape and received a code name, Operation Gold. It was the kind of name that seemed too obvious to be real, and perhaps for that reason it worked. Under its cloak was hidden the boldest collaboration between British and American intelligence services since the end of the war. The design was simple on paper, monumental in practice. A tunnel of about 500 meters excavated from the British sector of Berlin, crossing the demarcation line to reach the telephone lines of the Soviet barracks at Karlshorst. The point of entry would be disguised in an industrial warehouse on the outskirts of the Rudau district, officially registered as a radio maintenance station. No one outside a tiny circle would know the truth. The link between the two worlds, British and American, was embodied by three men so different that only espionage could have brought them together. William King Harvey, a CIA agent, was the practical engine of the project. A former Indianapolis policeman with a raspy voice and rough habits, he drank whiskey with the same method with which he planned operations, slowly, without spilling. He had the mind of an investigator and the temperament of a boxer. He did not believe in the abstract ideals of ideological war. He believed in results. For him, Operation Gold was not a romantic adventure, but a measurable experiment. If we manage to listen to them without their knowing, we will have won more than with 100 speeches, he said in his Midwestern accent, between a puff of smoke and a sip. At the other end of the spectrum was Peter Lunn, head of MI6 in Berlin, a man trained among manuals of strategy and diplomacy. With refined manners, a soft voice, and a precision bordering on obsession, he treated each phase of the operation as if it were a piece of Swiss clockwork. He always wore perfectly pressed suits, even underground, and believed intelligence should be executed with elegance. Where Harvey saw an operational problem, Lunn saw an opportunity for refinement. They argued often, but respected one another in silence. If we do this, Harvey told him one afternoon in the makeshift basement that would serve as the operations base, we'll need to keep it out of half of Berlin's eyes. And out of half of our own men's, Lunn added without lifting his gaze from the plan. Big secrets survive only when no one notices them. Moving between them was a third man, George Blake, the Anglo-Dutch liaison officer in charge of coordinating communication between London and Berlin. He was 31 years old, with a calm smile and a courtesy bordering on the clerical. He had survived a prisoner of war camp during the Korean War and spoke fluent Russian. His work seemed bureaucratic, almost invisible, conveying messages, drafting memoranda, maintaining balance among egos and jurisdictions. No one suspected that behind his serenity something else was hidden. Blake sincerely believed in the power of ideas, in the social justice promised by communism. After his captivity, he had become convinced that the West had lost its moral compass. He did not say it aloud, but his convictions had led him, years earlier, to offer his services to the KGB. When Lunn described him to his superiors, he called him meticulous and discreet. Harvey, less indulgent, defined him as too polite to be trustworthy. In the autumn of 1953, the three met for the first time in a technical meeting in West Berlin. On the table were maps of the subsoil, telephone diagrams, and aerial photographs of the eastern perimeter. The tension among them was palpable. The British wanted precision, the Americans wanted speed. "If we take too long, the Soviets will change the layout," said Harvey. "If we dig in a hurry, the tunnel will collapse," Lunn replied calmly. Blake watched them, taking notes in silence, the pen moving with a slowness that seemed studied. Interagency collaboration was formalized in December. London would provide diplomatic cover and local expertise. Langley would fund the infrastructure and listening technology. Under the false warehouse, British military engineers began installing German machinery dismantled from the war. Small excavators, electric generators, ventilation pumps. Everything had to operate within a decibel range that did not exceed the city's ambient noise. Upon supervising the first tunnel plans, Harvey allowed himself a mordant comment. "It's ironic, isn't it? We dig in secret to hear an enemy who also digs to listen to us." Lunn looked up and smiled with English courtesy. "The difference, William, is that we know how to keep quiet." George Blake smiled with them. No one noticed, but in his mind a decision had already taken shape. That operation would be his opportunity to show Moscow how much they trusted him. And so, while the engineers tuned the instruments and the plans took on body, Operation Gold got underway with a shared certainty and secret. They were about to dig the most dangerous border in the world. At the beginning of 1954, while the tunnel plans took shape in the EDT Allied offices, a man crossed by train from Berlin to Vienna with a dark leather suitcase. It was George Blake. He carried a British diplomatic passport and a calm, almost clerical air, that of someone who appears to be going to a routine conference. In reality, he was traveling to hold his first direct meeting with an officer of the Soviet Secret Service. In a small apartment in the suburbs of Vienna, Blake sat across from a man who introduced himself as Sergei. On the table there was tea, black bread, and silence. Sergei let him speak first. "I have high-level information," Blake said with a serenity that was not feigned. "A joint operation, British and American. They are going to dig." The Soviet raised his eyebrows. "Dig? A tunnel, under Berlin. They want to tap the telephone lines at Karlshorst." The meeting lasted less than an hour. Blake handed over names, approximate locations, work schedules, and security protocols. He did not ask for money. What he sought was conviction, purpose. The KGB immediately understood the value of that man. They registered him under a code name, Diomed. Back in Berlin, Blake resumed his routine with inhuman precision. He took notes, attended meetings, conveyed messages between MI6 and the CIA. He smiled, joked, worked more hours than anyone. No one suspected him. Sometimes, as he looked at the tunnel plans spread out on the table, he thought of the irony. The British were digging eastward without knowing that the Soviets already knew every meter of the route. In Moscow, the information was analyzed with caution. The KGB strategists understood that the find should not be revealed. If they warned the Westerners, they would lose a precious source, a channel of intelligence they could turn into a mirror. They decided to keep the secret. The instruction that came down from the Kremlin was brief. Do not intervene. The tunnel must continue. During the following months, while British and Americans advanced meter by meter under the soil of Berlin, the Soviets planned how to use that mistake to their advantage. They would allow the enemies to listen, but not just anything, only what they wanted them to hear. In a meeting at the Karlshorst barracks, General Sergei Kondrashov reviewed the reports in a neutral tone. We can leak real information in small doses. That way they'll believe what they're getting is gold. And we'll mix in false data about deployments and supply routes. A younger colonel asked, and if they suspect that we know? Kondrashov stubbed out his cigarette in the ashtray and replied without lifting his gaze, then they'll stop listening. And we want them to listen. Meanwhile, in the western sector, Harvey and Loon supervised the works, believing that each meter gained was a secret triumph. Sometimes they argued about timetables, sometimes they toasted with whiskey and tea to the invisible victory. In their midst, Blake kept his composure. He did so, with the calm of someone who knows the result is already decided. In his reports to Moscow, he described with surgical precision the progress of the excavation, the names of the engineers, the exact depth of the tunnel, even the brand of microphones they planned to install. And he added a recommendation: do not sabotage, do not alert, listen as well. During the following years, the tunnel became the best-kept secret of both sides. For the West, it was a masterpiece of engineering and stealth. For the Soviet Union, it was a laboratory of counterintelligence without risk. And at the center of it all, George Blake continued to walk between two worlds, invisible to both, convinced he served a cause that transcended him. His betrayal had not yet destroyed the project, but it had already sealed its fate. Spring of 1954. The project had ceased to be an idea on maps and had become an underground reality. In the southwestern edge of Berlin, inside an unremarkable building with the sign British-European Communications Exchange, the tunnel excavation began. From the outside, it looked like just another radio station, with technicians coming and going at all hours, cables on the floor, and the continuous hum of electric motors. No one on the surface suspected that, beneath those walls, the earth was being opened toward the heart of Soviet Berlin. The first team went down through a metal hatch to a depth of 5 meters. The light was scarce, the air thick. At that hour, 2 in the morning, surface traffic served as a noise curtain. Underground, the work had to be carried out with the precision of a surgeon and the discretion of a thief. Every shovel stroke, every valve turn was measured to the millimeter. The British had designed special machinery, compact excavators with gears bathed in dense grease to reduce noise, air pumps sheathed with rubber panels, and modified pneumatic hammers that vibrated at frequencies inaudible at the surface. The tunnel walls were reinforced with prefabricated steel arches and sealed with a rubber lining that prevented echo. The tunnel was 2.7 meters high and 2 meters wide, enough for men to move crouched with construction equipment and the recorders that would be installed later. They worked in 12-hour shifts. On rainy days, moisture seeped from the ground and the temperature dropped to the point of numbing fingers. The generators barely sufficed to power the dim lighting that turned the passage into an endless succession of shadows. Sometimes the silence was so dense one could hear one's own heartbeat inside the suit. Harvey went down once a week to supervise the progress. On each visit, he repeated the same warning in a grave voice, the flashlight trembling in his hand. "If we make noise, we'll dig our own graves." One of the engineers, drenched in sweat and mud, looked up and answered without stopping. "Then dig slowly." That exchange became a sort of motto. Digging slowly was more than an instruction. It was a philosophy. Each day, the teams advanced barely 2 or 3 meters, extracting the soil in small metal containers sent by a rail system toward the operations base. There, the spoil was disguised among the building's construction material and removed along with the day's waste. Nothing could betray the work. The air grew ever denser as the tunnel lengthened. Ventilation ducts and a water pumping system were installed to prevent seepage. On the surface, British civilian engineers adjusted the machine's power so that the vibrations matched the traffic on the nearby road. When a tram passed, the shovels turned. When the city slept, everything stopped. By midsummer, the tunnel already stretched more than 300 meters underground. Inside, the laborers worked in reverential silence. Some said that, if one stayed still long enough, one could hear through the walls the muffled voices of the city. Laughter, engines, footsteps on cobblestones. They did not know whether it was imagination or echo, but no one dared break the rhythm. At each end of the gallery, British and American technicians recorded the advances on detailed plans. Lunn, obsessive about proportions, demanded daily reports of depth and temperature. Harvey preferred to see the results in person, walking in the mud with his jacket open and an unlit cigarette in his mouth. The tunnel grew like a living organism, breathing through the fans fed by electricity and human sweat. Each meter excavated was a silent victory, a step closer to the objective. And above, Berlin kept beating, unaware that beneath its feet, 20 meters down, a corridor of steel and darkness was uniting two worlds that spied on each other even while they slept. The tunnel reached its objective in the spring of 1955, almost a year after excavation began. The drill emerged under the area of Alt-Glienicke, less than 10 meters from the underground lines connecting the Soviet barracks at Karlshorst with the bases of the East German Army. What had at first been a theoretical plan was transformed into a tangible structure, a gallery of steel and concrete breathing, humid, warm air, charged with electricity and secrecy. During the following weeks, teams of engineers and telecommunications specialists took turns underground to install the listening devices. Directional microphones were connected to the main cables, kilometers of copper wire were run to the operations base, and tape recorders were mounted with the capacity to record conversations 24 hours a day. In total, more than 400 microphones and 800 magnetic reels spun without rest in the penumbra. Each of them stored the echo of a world that did not know it was being overheard. In the surface building, the fake British Communications Center ran with meticulous routine. Men in suits, women with headsets, translators, and analysts moved through narrow corridors, filled with labeled reels. Karlshorst Command, Eastern Sector Military Lines, radio chatter, Priority 3. Each day, the recorded tapes were classified, numbered, and sent by diplomatic pouch to London and to Langley for analysis. The information was colossal. For more than a year, the Allied agencies intercepted more than 400,000 conversations, orders for troop movements, lists of supplies, reports on missile deployments, military intelligence cables, even personal conversations between Soviet officers. What had once been shadows became detail. What had been rumors, proofs. In an office in the British sector, Lunn reviewed the transcripts with a mix of satisfaction and amazement. He knew they would never again achieve anything like it. Harvey, more pragmatic, read the reports with a cigarette hanging from his lips. "Listen to this," he said once, holding a page. "They complain about the coffee. At the Soviet barracks in Karlshorst, the officers say American coffee is better." Lunn looked up and replied with British coolness, "Do not underestimate the small details, William. Empires are also measured by what they miss." Between them, they knew that what they had on their hands was an unprecedented achievement. In internal documents, the CIA referred to the installation as the jewel of Western espionage. It was war without shots, a war of voices, of cables and recordings. Every word captured was a bullet avoided. Unlike field operations, there were no visible heroes or medals, only a constant hum, the sound of reels turning in the machines, the scrape of needles tracking frequencies. The tunnel's breathing turned into an ear. Sometimes analysts spent hours listening to mundane conversations, weather, football, complaints about uniforms. But among those everyday fragments emerged pearls of pure information. Plans for military reorganization, changes of command, poorly coded encrypted reports revealing movements of nuclear material. Each clue fed an analysis network that ended in reports for Washington and London. Underground, the tunnel remained silent, invisible. On the surface, Berlin traffic continued its course, unaware that under the tires of the cars 20 meters down, the future of the war was being measured in fragments of voice. Harvey summed it up one night while he watched the monitors from the control room. "We don't need to see them. Listening is enough." And he was right. The new battlefield did not smell of gunpowder nor sound like gunfire. It sounded like telephone lines, like distant murmurs, like a language that crossed the ground to die on a reel of tape. The sound of voices was now the sound of war. While in the West, they celebrated the success of the operation, in the East, they already knew the Allies were listening. In a gray office in Karlshorst, KGB officers reviewed the reports of Agent Diomed. The tunnel was active, the lines tapped, the recordings running. The debate was not whether to destroy it, but how to make use of it. General Kondrashov convened his team at dawn. The barracks windows let in a pale, cold light. "Do not touch it," he said without raising his voice. "Let them listen." One of the young officers frowned. "And the confidential information, Comrade General?" "We will decide that," Kondrashov replied. "What leaves here will be what we want them to hear." Thus, a subtle strategy was born. Every conversation, every report transmitted over the main lines would be filtered, measured, rehearsed. The Soviets began to use the very listening channel as an instrument of disinformation. They inserted true data to lend credibility to the false. In the same day, they could communicate the real movement of a minor unit, along with invented coordinates of a supposed missile deployment. In the offices of MI6 and the CIA, analysts saw coherence where there was only theatrical precision. The KGB had turned the tunnel into an echo chamber. Every word spoken there was uttered, knowing it would be heard on the other side of the border. For Soviet technicians, the game had something of irony. For months, they feigned ignorance. When the noise on the lines changed due to the interference of Western microphones, Red Army engineers pretended to carry out routine inspections. They even sent each other coded messages designed to arouse the enemy's interest. A Soviet officer joked, "We should charge them for the entertainment service." Meanwhile, in West Berlin, the Allies suspected nothing. The conversations they intercepted seemed too good to be fake. In a meeting in Langley, Harvey commented enthusiastically, "We're hearing the bear talk in its sleep." Peter Lund, more prudent, answered, "Dreams are sometimes invented for whoever is listening behind the door." But enthusiasm outweighed caution. Each new reel of tape arriving from Berlin was received as proof that the tunnel worked. No one imagined that the information flowing toward them had been shaped, word by word, by the very men they intended to watch. In Moscow, Blake became a silent source of satisfaction. His reports confirmed that the British were convinced of absolute success. The KGB now knew exactly what their enemies knew and what they believed they knew. It was perfect symmetry, a mirror between two blind worlds. By mid-1955, the tunnel functioned like an organism with two brains, one in the West, which believed it heard the truth, another in the East, which chose what truth to allow. No gunfire, no troop movements, only cables, voices, and a deception spreading underground with the patience of dampness. The war had become a reflection of itself. And while the Allies believed they had a jewel, Moscow enjoyed the most expensive and silent joke of the entire Cold War. Spring of 1956. Berlin woke under a gray sky that smelled of wet earth. During the night, an electrical storm had traveled the city from south to north, leaving toppled poles and unusable telephone lines in its wake. In the district of Adlershof, Soviet technicians received the order to inspect a damaged stretch of wiring that connected the Karlshorst barracks with the eastern communications bases. It was a routine job, the kind of task carried out without hurry and without witnesses. By mid-morning, a maintenance brigade arrived at the site. Among them, a young engineer named Sergei Denisov. They began to dig in search of the exact point of the fault. The rain-soaked earth yielded easily. At a depth of 1 meter, the men found something they did not expect, a cable that appeared on no plan. It was thicker, made of a different material, with a metallic sheath that did not correspond to the Soviet standard. "This isn't ours," Denisov said, wiping the mud from the cable with his hand. The foreman, intrigued, ordered them to keep digging. At 2 meters, a curved metal structure appeared, with a rubber coating and English markings engraved on the joints. The men exchanged silent looks. One of them ran to the truck and radioed for instructions. The message reached the Ministry for State Security. In less than an hour, the area was surrounded by armed patrols. The engineers were moved aside. In their place arrived Stasi agents and KGB technicians. They brought flashlights, metal detectors, and an air of gravity that left no room for doubt. The ground began to open under the fine rain. Soon, a steel cylinder emerged, then a hatch, then a stretch of hidden wiring. The Soviets understood that this was not a simple electrical leak. They had stumbled upon something much bigger. One of the agents struck the hatch with a wrench. The hollow sound answered with an echo that spread beneath their feet. "There's space underneath," he murmured. The team commander, a man with a hoarse voice, gave the order. "Open it." When they removed the upper panels, a narrow passage appeared, lit by electric lamps still on. The air smelled of dampness and rusted metal. They descended a makeshift ladder and walked a few meters. The commander's flashlight illuminated walls lined with microphones, tape reels, transformers. Everything was still there, intact, as if time had stopped. One of the technicians approached a recorder and pressed a button. The reel turned and a voice in Russian, distorted yet clear, sprang from the speakers. They had found the heart of the tunnel. During the following days, entire KGB teams explored the passage. They measured its length, more than 500 meters from the entry point to the border of the British sector. The markings on the materials left no doubt: Western Electric, British Cable Works, made in UK. In Moscow, the find was reported as a victory, but the High Command knew it was not a full triumph. The tunnel had operated for almost a year. It had been useful to the Allies, though also to them. What mattered now was not what had been heard, but how to turn the discovery into a propaganda blow. The instruction came down from the Kremlin with a theatrical tone. Make it public. The world must see what the West is capable of doing beneath the surface of a divided city. It would not be a secret investigation, but a spectacle. In the following weeks, while the spring rains erased the traces of the original excavation, the Soviet army prepared the stage. The tunnel would be shown as a trophy and as a warning. Under Berlin's soil, the silence that had protected the operation for years had been broken. And this time, the noise would not come from microphones, but from cameras. April of 1956. The news spread through Berlin like an impossible rumor. The Soviets had discovered a Western tunnel under their territory. Within days, East German newspapers began to speak of a monstrous imperialist intrusion. The KGB decided that the find should not remain in the shadows. They would turn it into a spectacle. On the 21st of April, in an industrial hall in Adlershof, an unprecedented press conference was organized. Journalists from across the Eastern Bloc were summoned along with some Western correspondents who, surprised by the invitation, agreed to attend. The Soviets wanted the world to see the proof, for cameras to record the tunnel as an open wound beneath the soil of their occupied capital. At 10 o'clock sharp in the morning, the head of the KGB in East Germany, General Serov, appeared before the reporters accompanied by uniformed officers. He walked slowly to an improvised podium with the confidence of one who controls both the scene and the story. Behind him, a panel displayed large photographs of the tunnel, metal sections, tape reels, microphones, coiled cables, labels in English. "Citizens and comrades," he said in a grave voice, Here you have the proof of what Anglo-American imperialism does in the dark. While our peoples work for peace, they dig under our houses to listen to us." A murmur ran through the room. Cameras moved closer to the tables where the recovered artifacts had been laid out. Magnetic tape recorders, directional microphones, reels labeled with numbers, electric transformers, pieces of machinery with British factory stamps. Everything arranged with almost theatrical precision. The Soviet technicians, following the script, explained how the tunnel had been dug from the British sector, how it had crossed the border, and how the telephone lines of the Red Army had been intercepted. At one end of the hall, a stretch of the tunnel was reconstructed with its original panels. Journalists could go down a ladder and walk a few meters inside it. Flashes multiplied. "How long has this system been active?" a French journalist asked. Serov barely smiled. "Too long." But no more. The images circulated around the world. In London and Washington, spokesmen responded with cautious communiques. The CIA and MI6 denied any direct involvement. They spoke of a communications facility misinterpreted, of a technical project with no espionage ends. No one believed those words. The damage was done. In the newspapers of the East, the headlines spoke of the underground network of imperialism. In the West, the press tried to minimize the impact, describing the episode as a Soviet propaganda maneuver. But the photographs were too clear. The world had seen the microphones, the tapes, the English markings. In the CIA's offices, William Harvey threw the newspaper on the table without saying a word. Lunn, in London, read the headlines with an imperturbable expression, though he knew the scandal was real. "They have exposed us," Harvey said. "No," Lunn replied. "Everyone has exposed themselves. They for digging, we for believing the silence would last." That afternoon, in newsrooms around the world, the photographs of the Berlin Tunnel became front pages. In Moscow, copies of the report were exhibited in display cases as trophies. In Washington, Congress demanded explanations. In London, the Foreign Office kept silent. Operation Gold, the greatest technical achievement of Western espionage, had ended up as the greatest act of Soviet propaganda. Under Berlin's soil, there were no secrets left. Only the echo of an empty chamber and the remains of a tunnel that had connected two worlds for a brief and dangerous instant. For years, the story of the tunnel remained wrapped in contradictory versions. In the West, it was repeated that the discovery of 1956 had been a coincidence, a storm, an electrical fault, a stroke of luck. No one wanted to admit that the enemy might have known from the beginning. The case was filed away, the reports classified, names erased from official documents. But within British intelligence there remained a dull suspicion, a discomfort that did not disappear. In 1961, that suspicion became certainty. The British Special Branch arrested George Blake, the man who had served as liaison between the CIA and MI6 during Operation Gold. The investigation began with a minimal detail, a coincidence in counterintelligence files, and ended with a confession that left everyone motionless. Blake spoke without evasions or theatrics. He said he had informed the KGB from the first months of the project, that he had delivered plans, dates, locations, that Moscow had known about the tunnel even before the first meter was dug. Hours of interrogation turned into an inventory of treason. Agents took notes in silence as he recounted, with a serenity almost academic, his motives. He spoke of ideals, of disappointments, of his experience in the Korean War, where, he said, he had understood the hypocrisy of the Western world. He explained how he had contacted the KGB in Vienna, how he had offered his collaboration without asking for money. Not out of hatred, he said, but out of conviction. The revelation fell like a bomb. In Langley and in London, internal reports were written in restrained phrases, the most serious information leak in the service's history. Operation Gold, which for years had been presented as a technical success, revealed itself as a move manipulated by the enemy. The tunnel had not been discovered by chance, but controlled with precision throughout its operation. The Soviets had allowed the eavesdropping, had filtered selected information, and waited for the exact moment to exhibit the trap to the world. Even so, the project had not been entirely useless. Among the thousands of conversations intercepted, there was real data, logistical movements, names of officers, communication patterns. The information allowed the Allies to better understand the Soviet military structure in Germany. Still, none of that compensated for the political humiliation. The newspapers that years earlier had celebrated the operation fell silent. Inside the services, the evaluation reports concluded with a bitter sentence. The tunnel was not a total failure, but trust was. In May of 1961, George Blake was brought before the court. The sentence was exemplary: 42 years in prison, the longest punishment ever imposed for espionage in the United Kingdom. During the trial, he showed no remorse. He said he had done what he believed was right. His words, cold and polite, irritated even those who had admired him. 5 years later, in 1966, he escaped from Wormwood Scrubs prison with the help of sympathizers and crossed clandestinely into East Germany. From there, the KGB moved him to Moscow, where he lived the rest of his life under protection. He was received as a hero, though in the West, his name remained associated with pure betrayal. In British offices, no one spoke his name aloud for years. Peter Lunn was reassigned discreetly, and William Harvey, after clashing with his superiors in Langley, retired in bitterness. The Berlin Tunnel became an episode no one wanted to discuss, too costly to celebrate, too important to forget. Blake, for his part, lived quietly in Moscow, convinced he had acted on the right side of history. At times, he granted interviews to Russian media, recalling his life with a smile that never changed. He said he regretted nothing. The political borders were temporary accidents, but history did not absolve him. Operation Gold remained forever as a warning. Even the masterpieces of espionage can be mere sets on the stage of distrust. Today, over the neighborhoods of southern Berlin, there is no visible trace of the tunnel. The empty lots where it was dug were absorbed by urban growth, new streets, concrete blocks, modern warehouses. Beneath them, more than 20 meters down, remain the sealed remains of that gallery that joined for a brief instant two opposing worlds. No one visits it, no one mentions it. Only the yellowing plans in declassified archives recall that, for a few years, a corridor of steel and silence crossed the heart of the city. Sometimes workers who dig foundations find fragments of metal or pieces of cable covered in rubber and, without knowing it, deliver them to local museums. There, the engineers smile with respect, the remains of an operation as audacious as it was absurd, a technical masterpiece built on distrust and destroyed by an invisible betrayal. The Berlin Tunnel was a buried metaphor. It represented the obsession of an era that believed truth could be excavated, that it was enough to drill deep enough to find it. The British and the Americans dug eastward, convinced that there lay the secret that could save the free world. The Soviets, knowing the truth from the start, let it continue in order to hear the enemy's arrogance. In the end, both sides obtained what they wanted: information, propaganda, certainty of their own intelligence, and both lost the same thing: the illusion of control. In the Cold War, information was more valuable than gold, but sometimes even gold turned into a trap. Decades later, declassified documents revealed the real scope of the operation. The CIA and MI6 had indeed obtained valuable data, but they had also been manipulated with surgical precision. What they believed they were hearing from the enemy was, to a great extent, an echo of their own desire. They dug to discover secrets, and what they found was their own reflection. Berlin survived the walls, the cables, the borders. The city that had been a laboratory of distrust is now an open map, crisscrossed by trams and tourists. Under its streets, the tunnel remains sealed, turned into a fossil of a time when fear dug deeper than any tool. MI6 dug beneath Berlin to listen to the enemy, and ended up hearing its own echo.